For 3 years, my daughter-in-law told me my son was too busy to visit. And I believed her right up until the moment a hospital nurse lowered her voice and said my name. "Mrs. Gilbert," she asked. "Yes." I said, "This is Marcia Gilbert. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created by the Her Chains Channel team, based on real-life situations to convey lessons about family, emotions, and human values. All characters and events are illustrative." She paused, just long enough to make the silence feel deliberate. "My name is Elaine Porter. I'm calling from the hospital. I need you to listen carefully." I told her she could speak freely. She did not. "Your son, Daniel, has been treated here 47 times this year." I laughed once, quietly, because my mind rejected the number before my heart could catch up. "That isn't possible." I said, "My daughter-in-law says he's been working nonstop. I barely hear from him." The nurse didn't argue. She simply continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Mrs. Gilbert, I need you to come in today. Please come alone, and do not tell his wife you're coming." My hand tightened around the phone. Why would I hide a hospital visit from my own family? Another pause. "Then, because every time your son comes here, his wife insists on staying with him. And because this time, your son asked us to call you. I asked where Daniel was now. She said he was stable. She did not say he was fine." I sat there, holding the receiver, thinking of all the times Lydia had smiled gently and said, "He's just too busy, Marcia." Thinking of the birthdays he missed, the surgery I recovered from alone, the way his voice had grown thinner each year, like something being stretched too far. "This isn't about work, is it?" I said. "No," the nurse replied. "It isn't." She gave me the address, repeated the instruction, and hung up before I could ask anything else. I didn't call Lydia. I didn't call anyone. I picked up my keys, my hands steady in a way that felt false, and locked the door behind me. Whatever had been keeping my son away from me for 3 years was no longer hiding. Lydia always answered Daniel's phone. "Marcia, he's in a meeting," she would say, warm and efficient, as if she were doing me a favor. "I'll tell him you called." Sometimes I heard him in the background, a chair scraping, a breath held too long. Once, I heard him say my name, faint and cut off, before the line went quiet. Another time I tried again an hour later. Lydia picked up on the second ring. "He's slammed today," she said. "Deadlines. You know how he is." I did know how my son worked. Daniel had always pushed himself. That was why her explanations landed so easily. Stress, long hours, exhaustion. She said those words like they were facts, not choices. On my birthday that year, I waited until evening. Lydia texted instead of calling. He meant to call. He fell asleep at his desk. I told myself it was sweet that she covered for him at Thanksgiving. She sent a photo of a table I did not recognize and wrote, "We're keeping it small this year, at Christmas," she said. "Travel isn't realistic right now." When I had surgery, nothing serious but frightening enough to make me want my child nearby. I left a message on Daniel's voicemail. He did not return it. Lydia called the next day. "He was worried about you," she said. "He just didn't want to overwhelm you." That sentence stayed with me. I repeated it when neighbors asked why my son hadn't visited. I repeated it to my sister. I repeated it to myself. Once, I pressed, "Could you put him on? Lydia, I'd like to hear his voice." There was a pause. "He's stepped out," she said. "I'll have him call when he's free." He never did. I told myself marriages rearrange priorities. I told myself patience was kindness. What I did not tell myself was the truth. Sitting underneath all that understanding, confronting her, meant risking the little access I still had. So I accepted the silence. I smoothed it over. I let 3 years pass, believing a lie because it arrived wrapped in reason. Daniel's voice was the first thing that changed. It didn't disappear all at once. It thinned, flattened. When I did hear from him, it sounded like he was reading from a version of himself he no longer believed in. "I'm fine, Mom," he said once. After I caught him directly on his phone by accident, his voice was calm, almost rehearsed, just tired, before I could say anything else. Lydia's voice slid in beside his. "He's been working non-stop," she said. I told him not to answer. He needs rest. The call ended before I could respond. I told myself that couples spoke for each other sometimes. I told myself it was efficiency, not control. Still, I noticed how every detail came through her. Dates, schedules, explanations. Daniel no longer told me where he was. He no longer chose when to call. Once, I said, "Daniel, are you coming for your birthday this year?" There was a pause. Then Lydia answered, "We're doing something small. He doesn't want to make a fuss." Another time, I asked, "Is he still seeing his old friends?" She smiled in her voice. "They've grown apart. It happens." Each answer closed a door gently, politely, until I stopped reaching for the handle. I noticed the way Daniel spoke slower, like he was measuring every word. I noticed he never complained anymore. Not about work, not about his marriage, not about anything. My son had never been dramatic, but he had always been honest. Silence was new. The truth was simpler than all my excuses. I was afraid that if I challenged Lydia, she would make good on the distance she controlled. Afraid that pushing too hard would turn silence into absence. I had seen other mothers lose their children that way, cut off in the name of boundaries they were never allowed to understand. So when Lydia explained, I nodded. When Daniel didn't call back, I waited. When holidays passed without him, I told people he was busy. What I did not notice, or pretended not to, was how much effort it took to keep believing her. How often I chose comfort over clarity. How patience, stretched long enough, began to look like permission. By the time the phone rang from the hospital, the pattern had already been there for years. I just hadn't wanted to name it. Nurse Elaine Porter met me at the desk without asking my name again. She looked relieved that I had come alone. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said. "We don't usually make calls like this." "I understand," I replied, though I didn't. "Not yet." She led me to a small office and closed the door behind us. "Your son is resting," she said carefully. "Physically stable. Emotionally guarded." I asked to see him. She shook her head once. "Not yet. There are procedures we have to follow." Then she placed a folder in front of me. It was thicker than I expected. Not a single visit's worth of paper, but a history. The kind that accumulates quietly when no one stops it. "Before you open it," she said, lowering her voice again. "I need to be clear. Your son gave consent for you to be contacted. He asked that his wife not be informed." I nodded and opened the folder. The pages did not shout. They didn't need to. Dates lined up in neat columns. Injuries described with professional restraint. Bruising. Fractures. Imaging notes. Follow-up visits that came closer together as the months passed. Most of these were explained as accidents. Elaine said, falls. Work-related strain. I turned another page. Then another. Each visit ended with the same phrase written by different hands, "Wife present." She insisted on being in the room, Elaine added. Sometimes she answered questions for him. I stopped reading. Did anyone ever question that Elaine met my eyes? That's why I'm speaking to you now. I continued. Notes mentioned hesitation. Anxiety marked as situational. Pain listed more than once. Never fully resolved. There were gaps. 2 days where he vanished from the record, then returned with injuries that looked older than the explanation. "This isn't random," I said quietly. "No," Elaine replied. "It isn't." I closed the folder, my palms resting flat on the cover as if it might move on its own. 3 years of being told my son was too busy collapsed into something deliberate and methodical. Elaine slid a consent form toward me. You can request copies. I want everything, I said. She nodded, already reaching for the paperwork. The weight I carried out of that office was not just paper. It was the understanding that silence had been managed, visits had been controlled, and my son's absence from my life had been carefully arranged. I didn't read the file all at once. I read it the way you touch something you already know is hot carefully, expecting pain. The visits were listed in order, each one dated, each one cleanly typed. The first few were spaced weeks apart, then days, then sometimes only hours. Different doctors, different handwriting, the same restraint. Falls. One note read, overexertion. Another, accidental impact. Written more than once. Elaine sat across from me. Silent, but present. When I stopped on one page too long, she said, "You're not imagining the pattern." I turned the page. A fractured rib, then a wrist injury, then the same wrist, noted again weeks later, described as healing, but aggravated. Repeated force was implied without being written. Did he ever explain? I asked. Elaine answered without hesitation. He tried. Then he stopped. The phrase patient, hesitant to explain appeared again and again, always followed by the same line at the bottom. Wife present. She corrected him. Elaine said, or answered first. I reached a section where the pages thinned. A gap of several days. Then another visit. The injuries older than the explanation attached to them. Where was he during these gaps, I asked. Elaine shook her head. We don't know. He didn't come in. And when he did, he asked that nothing be documented beyond the basics. I closed my eyes for a moment. 47 visits in 1 year was not clumsiness. It was endurance. It was someone measuring pain against consequences and choosing pain because it was predictable. He wasn't avoiding me. I said quietly. Elaine did not correct me. She waited. He wasn't too busy. I continued. He was contained. That word felt accurate. Contained by schedules he didn't control, by explanations written for him, by someone always in the room, always close enough to hear what he said. I reached the last page and rested my hand there. The dates told the story my son had not been allowed to tell. His absence from my life was not distance. It was design. When I looked up, Elaine was watching me carefully. Do you still want the copies, she asked? Yes, I said, and I want to know what he asked for. He asked for time, she replied, and he asked us to make sure you came first. I gathered the file and held it to my chest. 47 visits had finally led him back to me. Not because he could leave, but because he had run out of places to hide. Daniel had never been loud, even as a boy. He avoided the center of any room. When other children argued, he waited for the noise to pass. When something broke, he tried to fix it before anyone noticed. I used to call it maturity. Later, I understood it was caution. You don't have to keep everyone calm, I told him once. Years ago, he smiled and said, "It's easier if I do." That was the boy Lydia married. As I sat with the copies of his medical file in my hands, that sentence came back to me with new weight. Every note about hesitation, every correction made on his behalf, fit the same pattern. Daniel didn't fight when conflict grew close. He absorbed it. He made himself smaller. I thought of the way Lydia spoke for him, not sharply, not cruelly. She used concern as leverage. He doesn't like confrontation. She had told me more than once. I handle these things so he doesn't have to. I had thanked her for that. I had mistaken control for care. When Daniel stopped calling, I assumed distance. When his voice flattened, I assumed exhaustion. I never considered that silence could be a strategy, not a choice. Elaine had said he tried to explain. Then he stopped. I imagined him in that room, weighing each word against the consequences of saying it. I imagined how often he must have decided it was safer to endure than to resist. 47 hospital visits were not failures to leave. They were attempts to stay alive without making things worse. I should have seen this, I said aloud, though no one was there to hear me. What mattered now was not what I had missed, but what I understood. My son was not lost. He was constrained, and constraint could be broken. Grief had kept me still for 3 years. Clarity did the opposite. I no longer needed explanations from Lydia. I no longer needed permission. I gathered the papers and set them neatly in my bag. The shape of my fear changed as I stood. It was no longer the fear of losing access. It was the fear of waiting too long to act. By the time I left the hospital, I was no longer a mother wondering where her son had gone. I was a mother who knew exactly where he was and what it would take to bring him home. I did not confront Lydia that day. I did not call her. I did not let myself imagine the satisfaction of saying her name out loud with accusation attached to it. Anger would have been easier. Anger also would have ruined everything. Instead, I organized. I spread the hospital copies across my kitchen table and labeled them by date. I highlighted repetitions. I wrote down the names of doctors who appeared more than once. I did not rush. I did not cry. Calm, I reminded myself, was a decision. When Elaine called that evening, she did not sound surprised that I answered on the first ring. "There's something else you should know," she said. I listened. "She monitors his phone," Elaine continued. "He doesn't bring it into the exam room anymore. When we need privacy, he asks for water or steps into the restroom. That's when he talks." My grip tightened on the pen. "Has she interfered before?" "Yes," Elaine said. "She's filed complaints. She's challenged notes. She's demanded access to records he didn't authorize. That's why we were careful calling you. Careful how I asked. Careful not to alert her," Elaine replied. "Because when she feels control slipping, she tightens it." That sentence settled heavily. I pictured Lydia's pleasant voice, her reassuring phrases, the way she redirected every concern without ever sounding defensive. "Do you think she knows you contacted me?" I asked. "Not yet," Elaine said. "But that won't last. He has a follow-up scheduled in 2 days. She usually attends." 2 days. The window was narrower than I had hoped. After the call, I tried Daniel's number once. It rang twice before going to voicemail. A minute later, my phone lit up with Lydia's name. "Marcia," she said cheerfully. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "I was just thinking of Daniel." There was a pause. "Barely there. He's resting. I'll let him know you called." I let the silence stretch just long enough to register. "Please do," I said. When we hung up, my hands were steady again. One wrong word would have warned her. One accusation would have closed ranks around my son. I gathered the papers into a single folder and placed it by the door. Calm did not mean passive. It meant precise. If I moved too fast, Lydia would isolate him further. If I waited too long, he might decide silence was safer again. 2 days. That was all I had. Lydia arrived early and waved as if we were meeting to celebrate something. "Marcia," she said warmly, sitting down before I could pull out my chair. "I was surprised you called. Daniel's been meaning to visit." I smiled and waited. She took that as permission. "Work has been relentless." She continued, "You know how much pressure he's under. I keep telling him he doesn't have to prove anything." "I'm sure," I said. She leaned forward. "He worries about you. He just doesn't want to add stress." There it was again. The familiar translation of silence into concern. "I spoke with the hospital," I said calmly, her hand stilled around her cup for half a second. "Not long enough to notice unless you were watching for it." "Oh," she said. "He didn't mention that." "I didn't speak to him." I replied, "I spoke to a nurse?" Lydia smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. Hospitals exaggerate. Daniel hates being fussed over. I nodded. That must be why you attend every appointment. Her posture straightened. Someone has to advocate for him. Advocate, I repeated. Or answer for him. The smile tightened. He prefers it that way. I'm sure that's what you tell yourself, I said gently. She studied me then, recalibrating. If this is about boundaries. Marcia. I think we should be clear. Daniel and I manage our own affairs. I agree. I said, that's exactly why I called you here. Her fingers drummed once on the table. You're reading too much into things. I haven't accused you of anything, I replied. I haven't even raised my voice. That unsettled her more than anger would have. She gathered her purse. Standing abruptly, I'll tell Daniel you were concerned. She said, he doesn't need unnecessary stress. Of course, I said. She left believing the conversation had ended on her terms. Believing she still spoke for him. Believing control remained intact. I watched her go, not because I feared her reaction, but because I recognized it. People who think they are winning always leave too quickly. I went to Daniel's apartment while Lydia was at her follow-up meeting, the one she had mentioned too casually to be casual. She liked schedules. She trusted them. That was my opening. Daniel answered the door after the second knock. His face changed when he saw me, not surprise, but calculation. Mom, he said quickly. You shouldn't be here. I know, I replied. That's why I came. He stepped aside without inviting me in. His hands were shaking. He kept them in his pockets. She didn't send you, did she? He asked. No, I said. She doesn't know. He exhaled sharply and looked past me toward the hallway, as if expecting her to appear anyway. I'm fine, he said. You don't need to worry. I've seen the records. I said, all of them. His jaw tightened. They don't mean anything. I told them not to make a big deal. His phone buzzed on the counter. Then again. Lydia's name lit the screen. He didn't answer. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to listen. He laughed once. Brittle and humorless. There isn't time. The phone buzzed again. He flinched this time. She watches everything, he said quietly. If she thinks I'm choosing sides. You don't have to choose a side, I said. You only have to choose yourself. The phone buzzed again. He turned it face down. I tried to tell you, he said, the words barely there. I just couldn't figure out how without making it worse. You don't have to explain, I said. You don't have to convince me. He looked at the door, then at me. For a moment, he didn't move at all. Then he grabbed his jacket. I can't come back, he said. I know, I replied. He stepped past me into the hall, leaving the phone on the counter, still vibrating with her name. We didn't look back. Justice, I learned, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly, one form at a time, until there is nothing left to argue with. I submitted the copies to the hospital advocate first. Elaine walked me through the process without ceremony. This establishes a pattern, she said. Once that's on record, it can't be undone. The attorney I met afterward was a man Daniel trusted, someone Lydia had never approved of. He reviewed the file once, then closed it. She loses access immediately. He said, accounts, medical authority, financial decisions. From here on, she answers questions instead of controlling them. She tried to call Daniel that night, then me. The messages shifted in tone as hours passed, concern, confusion, then anger dressed up as worry. No one returned them. The consequences arrived in stages. Lydia was removed from Daniel's medical permissions. Her name disappeared from shared accounts pending review. When she tried to explain herself to people who had once deferred to her, the record spoke first. Credibility, once cracked, does not repair itself. Daniel stayed with me, not as someone recovering from loss, but as someone learning how to choose. He decided when to sleep, when to speak, when to be silent. Forgiveness was never demanded. Healing moved at his pace. One evening, as we put away dishes, he picked up the old mug with the crack in its handle. "Why keep this one?" he asked. "Because it still holds," I said, and because pretending it isn't cracked never helped. Here's the lesson this season of my life taught me. Love does not require endurance of control. Silence is not peace if it costs you your voice. And boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. If this story resonated with you, tap like, leave a comment, or subscribe. Someone listening might need to hear that quiet justice is still justice, and that choosing yourself is never the wrong ending.